The morning alarm buzzed at 5:30, just like every other day for the past 4 years. Lisa rolled out of bed, her body aching from yesterday's double shift. She caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror and barely recognized the tired woman. Staring back, dark circles under her eyes told the story of too many late nights and not enough sleep. Her hands, once soft and carefully maintained for playing violin, now showed the wear of countless hours washing dishes and carrying heavy trays. 4 years ago, she had walked across the stage at the music conservatory with such hope in her heart. Her professors had praised her technique. Her fellow students had envied her natural talent. Everyone said she had what it took to make it as a professional musician. The world was supposed to open up for her after graduation, with orchestra, positions and recording contracts waiting just around the corner, but reality hit hard and fast. The music industry was nothing like what her professors had described. For every open position in a symphony orchestra, there were hundreds of qualified applicants. The audition process was brutal and expensive. She had to travel to different cities, pay for hotels, and take time off work she couldn't afford to lose. And after each rejection, she had to pick herself up and try again. The student loans were the worst part. $45,000 in debt for a degree that seemed worthless in the real world. Every month that payment came due whether she had work or not. Her violin, worth more than her car, sat in its case most days while she served coffee and cleaned tables to make ends meet. Murphy's Diner wasn't the worst place to work, but it wasn't great either. The owner, a man in his 60s named Robert, was fair but distant. He paid minimum wage and didn't offer health insurance, but he didn't yell at his employees like some of the other restaurant owners in town. The customers ranged from friendly to rude, with most falling somewhere in between. Construction workers grabbed quick breakfasts before heading to job sites. Office workers stopped by for lunch breaks. Families came in for weekend dinners when they wanted comfort food without the hassle of cooking. Lisa had gotten good at reading people quickly. The businessman who ordered black coffee and a plain bagel was always in a hurry and didn't want conversation. The elderly woman who came in every Tuesday for tea and toast was lonely and appreciated a few kind words. The group of teenagers who showed up after school games were loud but harmless, just excited about being young and free. What bothered her most wasn't the work itself, but the feeling that she was wasting her talents. Every day that passed without touching her violin felt like a small death. Her fingers were losing their calluses from years of practice. Her ear was getting rusty from lack of use. Sometimes she wondered if she'd even remember how to play properly anymore. The other waitresses were nice enough, but they didn't understand her situation. Most of them had never been to college and saw the job as a way to support their families or earn spending money. They couldn't relate to the crushing disappointment of having dreams that didn't work out. When Lisa mentioned her music background, they'd make jokes about playing for tips or suggest she perform at the local bar's open mic night. They meant well, but it hurt every time. Her apartment was small and cramped, but it was all she could afford on her salary. The walls were thin enough that she worried about disturbing neighbors if she practiced violin. A few times she'd tried playing quietly, but it felt pointless without being able to hear herself properly. Music was meant to fill a space, to reach people's hearts. Playing in whispers defeated the whole purpose. The worst moments came during her breaks at work. She'd sit in her car and see her violin case in the back seat, covered with a blanket like she was ashamed of it. Sometimes she'd open the case just to look at the instrument. The wood still gleamed. The strings were still in tune from the last time she'd played weeks ago. It represented everything she'd worked for and everything she'd lost. Money was always tight. After rent, student loan payments, car insurance, and groceries, there was barely anything left over. She couldn't afford to go out with friends or buy new clothes. Her social life had shrunk to almost nothing because she couldn't keep up with people who had normal jobs and disposable income. Dating was out of the question when she worked nights and weekends and couldn't afford to split dinner bills. Her parents tried to be supportive, but she could hear the disappointment in their voices during their weekly phone calls. They'd sacrificed to help pay for her education, working extra hours and taking on debt of their own. Now they watched their daughter serve food to strangers while her expensive degree gathered dust. They never said it directly, but she knew. They wondered if they'd made a mistake encouraging her musical dreams. The diner's regular customers had started to recognize her, which was both comforting and depressing. Being known meant better tips and easier shifts, but it also meant accepting that this might be her life for the foreseeable future. Some of the older customers would ask about her plans, clearly sensing she was overqualified for the job. She'd give vague answers about temporary work while pursuing other opportunities. But the truth was, she'd stopped believing those opportunities existed. Every morning when she tied her apron and grabbed her order pad, Lisa made a silent promise to herself that this wouldn't be forever. She'd find a way back to music somehow. But as the days turned into months and the months turned into years, that promise felt more and more like a lie. The music world had moved on without her, and she was stuck in a cycle of just surviving instead of truly living, yet somewhere deep inside, beneath all the exhaustion and disappointment, a small flame still burned. When she heard classical music on the radio or caught a glimpse of a violin in a movie, something stirred in her chest. Her fingers would unconsciously move as if playing invisible notes. Her heart would speed up slightly, remembering what it felt like to create something beautiful. That tiny spark of hope was all she had left, and she guarded it carefully, knowing that if it ever went out completely, she might never find her way back to who she was meant to be. Tuesday afternoon at Murphy's Diner was always the slowest time of the week. The lunch rush had ended hours ago, and dinner customers wouldn't start arriving for another 2 hours. Lisa found herself wiping down the same clean tables for the third time, just to have something to do. The diner felt eerily quiet without its usual background noise. That's when she noticed something was wrong with the jukebox. The old machine had been making strange grinding sounds for weeks, but Robert kept saying he'd fix it later. Money was tight, and a broken jukebox wasn't exactly an emergency. But today, something had finally given up completely. The usual mix of classic rock and country music that provided the diner soundtrack had gone silent. At first, the quiet felt peaceful. Lisa could hear the coffee maker gurgling, the soft hum of the refrigerator, and the occasional car passing by outside. But as the minutes ticked by, the silence started to feel heavy and uncomfortable. She'd grown so used to having background music that its absence felt unnatural, like something important was missing. The few customers scattered around the diner seemed to notice it too. Old Frank, who came in every Tuesday for his coffee and pie, kept looking around like he couldn't figure out what was different. The young mother with her toddler in the corner booth looked uncomfortable, probably because her usually chatty child had gone unusually quiet in the strange atmosphere. Lisa mentioned the broken jukebox to Robert when he came out of his office to check on things. He just shrugged and said they'd have to make do without music for a while. The repair guy wanted $200 just to look at the machine, and that was money Robert didn't have right now. Business had been slow lately, and every expense had to be carefully considered. As Lisa continued her shift in the unnatural quiet, her mind started to wander. She found herself humming softly under her breath, old classical pieces she'd learned years ago in school. The melodies came back to her easily, like riding a bicycle after years away. Her fingers started moving unconsciously, pressing against invisible violin strings as she carried trays and filled coffee cups. That's when she happened to glance out the window and saw her car in the parking lot. More specifically, she saw the shape of her violin case in the back seat, covered by an old blanket. She'd been carrying it around for months, telling herself she'd practice when she found time, but somehow never actually doing it. The case had become like a security blanket, a reminder of who she used to be, even if she never opened it anymore. A crazy idea started forming in her mind. What if she brought her violin inside? What if she played some background music for the customers? It wasn't like she'd be performing a concert or anything dramatic. Just soft, pleasant music to fill the uncomfortable silence. She'd played background music for events before during her college years. Wedding receptions and dinner parties where people mostly ignored the music but appreciated having it there. The more she thought about it, the more the idea made sense. The diner needed music, and she had the ability to provide it. Of course, there were a dozen reasons why it might not work. The customers might think classical music was too fancy for a place like Murphy's. Robert might think she was being ridiculous. Other employees might make fun of her for trying to show off her education, but as she looked around at the uncomfortable silence and the customers who seemed slightly on edge without their familiar background soundtrack, Lisa decided the idea was worth suggesting. The worst thing that could happen was Robert would say no, and they'd continue suffering through the quiet until he could afford to fix the jukebox. She waited until there was a lull in customers before approaching Robert. He was doing paperwork at the counter, probably trying to figure out how to stretch the restaurant's budget to cover necessary repairs. Lisa felt nervous as she walked over, but she tried to keep her voice casual and confident. She explained her idea simply. The diner needed background music, and she happened to have a violin in her car. She could play softly while she worked, just enough to fill the silence and make customers more comfortable. She wouldn't expect extra pay or special treatment, just permission to help solve their current problem with the resources they had available. Robert looked up from his paperwork with a surprised expression. In 4 years of working together, Lisa had never mentioned her musical background. He knew she was overqualified for waitressing work, but lots of people ended up in jobs that didn't match their education. He'd assumed she had some kind of business or liberal arts degree, not training in classical music. The request caught him completely off guard. His first instinct was to say no, worried that live music might be too distracting or that customers would expect some kind of professional performance. But as he looked around the unusually quiet diner and saw how uncomfortable everyone seemed, he started to reconsider. Murphy's Diner had never been the kind of place that attracted attention or did anything unusual. It was a simple, straightforward restaurant that served decent food at reasonable prices. Adding live music, even quiet background music, would definitely be different. But different might not be bad, especially if it made customers more comfortable and maybe even attracted. Some new business. Robert found himself curious about what Lisa could actually do with a violin. He'd never heard her mention music before, so he had no idea if she was actually good or just someone who'd taken a few lessons years ago. But she seemed confident about her ability, and desperate times called for creative solutions. After thinking for a moment, Robert surprised himself by agreeing to let her try it. He had a few conditions, though. The music had to be quiet enough that customers could still have conversations. She couldn't let it interfere with her regular waitressing duties. And if any customers complained or seemed bothered by it, she'd have to stop immediately. Lisa felt a rush of excitement mixed with nervousness as she agreed to his terms. It had been so long since she'd played for anyone other than herself. What if her fingers were too rusty? What if she'd forgotten more? Then she realized, what if the customers hated classical music and made her feel foolish for even trying? But beneath all those worries was something she hadn't felt in years: anticipation. For the first time in a long time, she was about to do something that felt meaningful, something that connected to who she really was underneath the tired waitress uniform. As she walked toward the door to get her violin from the car, Lisa felt like she was taking the first step on a journey she couldn't even imagine. Yet, Lisa's hands were shaking slightly as she walked across the parking lot to her car. The autumn air felt crisp against her face, and she could hear her heart beating faster than usual. It had been months since she'd even opened her violin case, let alone played for other people. What if she'd made a terrible mistake? What if she'd forgotten how to play properly? She pulled the blanket off her violin case and carefully lifted it out of the back seat. The case felt heavier than she remembered, or maybe that was just her nerves making everything feel more difficult. As she walked back toward the diner, she could see Robert and the few customers inside through the large windows. They all looked normal, going about their business, completely unaware that their quiet Tuesday afternoon was about to change in a way none of them could predict. The little bell above the door chimed as she entered, and suddenly everyone's eyes were on her, and the violin case in her hands. Lisa felt heat rush to her cheeks. She'd been invisible as a waitress for so long that being the center of attention felt strange and uncomfortable. Frank looked up from his coffee with curiosity. The young mother glanced over while trying to keep her toddler entertained. Robert emerged from behind the counter to watch what would happen next. Lisa found a spot near the counter, where she wouldn't be in anyone's way but could still be heard throughout the small diner. Her fingers fumbled slightly with the latches on the case. When she finally opened it, the sight of her violin took her breath away. The wood still gleamed beautifully, and the instrument looked exactly as perfect as the day she'd bought it with money from her college graduation gifts. She lifted the violin carefully, feeling its familiar weight in her hands. The muscle memory was still there, even after all these months. Her left hand found its position on the neck while her right hand picked up the bow. She could feel everyone watching her, and the pressure made her mouth go dry. What if she sounded terrible? What if years of not practicing had ruined her technique? Lisa decided to start with something simple and universally beautiful. She chose a piece that had always been one of her favorites, something gentle and flowing. That wouldn't startle anyone or demand too much attention. As she raised the bow to the strings, she took a deep breath and tried to forget about her audience. The first note came out slightly shaky, and she winced internally. But as she continued, her confidence grew. The familiar patterns came back to her fingers naturally, like speaking a language she'd learned as a child. The music filled the empty spaces in the diner, wrapping around the tables and chairs and settling into corners that had been silent for too long. She kept her eyes mostly closed, focusing on the music rather than the people listening. The violin sang sweetly, its voice carrying all the emotions she'd been holding inside for years. Every note felt like a small release, a way of expressing things she couldn't put into words. This was who she really was underneath the tired waitress exterior. This was the person she'd almost forgotten existed when she glanced up briefly. She was surprised to see that Frank had stopped eating entirely. The gruff old man who usually just grunted his order and left. A small tip was staring at her with an expression she'd never seen before. His weathered face looked softer somehow, and she could swear she saw moisture gathering in his eyes. The young mother had also stopped what she was doing. Her toddler, who had been fussy and restless in the unusual quiet, had gone completely. Still, the little boy was listening to the music with the kind of pure attention that only children can give. His eyes wide and focused on Lisa's moving bow. Even Robert looked amazed. He stood behind the counter with his arms crossed, but his usual businesslike expression had been replaced by something that looked almost like wonder. She'd worked for him for 4 years, and she realized he was seeing a completely different person than the waitress he thought he knew. As Lisa continued playing, she started to feel something she hadn't experienced in years, the pure joy of making music for people who needed to hear it. This wasn't a formal concert hall with people who had paid to be impressed. These were regular people going about their ordinary lives, and somehow her music was touching them in ways she hadn't expected. The piece she'd chosen was about 6 minutes long, and as she approached the ending, Lisa felt both relief and sadness. Relief because she'd managed to play without making any major mistakes, and sadness because she didn't want this magical moment to end. When the final note faded away, the silence that followed felt completely different from the uncomfortable quiet that had started the whole thing. For a moment, nobody moved or spoke. Then Frank started clapping, slowly at first, then with more enthusiasm. The young mother joined in, and even her toddler clapped his small hands together with delight. Robert nodded approvingly from behind the counter, and Lisa felt tears prick at her eyes. She hadn't expected applause. She'd thought people might ignore the music or politely tolerate it, the way background music usually worked. But these people had actually listened, really listened, and somehow been moved by what they heard. It was the first time in years that Lisa felt like her musical training had been worth something. Frank cleared his throat and spoke up, his voice rougher than usual. He said the music reminded him of something from long ago, something beautiful he'd almost forgotten. He didn't elaborate, but there was a depth of feeling in his simple words that made Lisa's heart skip a beat. The young mother approached with her toddler and thanked Lisa for the beautiful music. She explained that her son had been fussy all day, but the violin had calmed him completely. She asked if Lisa might play again sometime, and the hope in her voice was unmistakable. Even Robert seemed impressed. He told Lisa that was the most peaceful the diner had felt in weeks, and maybe they'd found a solution to their jukebox problem after all. He suggested she play for a little while each day, just to see how customers responded. As Lisa carefully put her violin away, she felt like she was waking up from a long dream. For the first time in years, she'd used her talents for something meaningful. She'd brought beauty into an ordinary place and touched people's hearts in ways she never could have imagined. The tired waitress who had walked into work that morning felt like a different person entirely. She didn't know it yet, but this simple act of playing her violin in a small diner was about to change not just her own life, but the lives of everyone who walked through those doors. Something special had been born in those 6 minutes of music, something that would grow in ways none of them could predict. Word spread faster than Lisa had expected. By Thursday, she noticed more people than usual coming into the diner during her shift. Some were regulars who had heard about the violin music from Frank or other customers. Others seemed to be curious. Newcomers who had gotten wind of something different happening at Murphy's Diner. Robert had given her permission to play for about 15 minutes during the slow afternoon hours, and Lisa found herself looking forward to that time more than anything else in her day. She started arriving at work 30 minutes early just to tune her violin and decide what pieces to play. For the first time in years, she felt excited about going to work. The most surprising thing was how wrong she'd been about her customers. Lisa had made assumptions about what kind of music these people would like, thinking that classical violin would be too fancy or boring for a working-class diner. She couldn't have been more mistaken. Carmen, a single mother who worked double shifts at the local factory, had become one of her most devoted listeners. Lisa had always seen Carmen rushing in and out, grabbing quick meals between her jobs, looking stressed and tired. But when the violin music started, Carmen would slow down completely. She'd find a table in the corner and just sit, letting the music wash over her while she ate. One day, Carmen approached Lisa after a particularly beautiful piece and shared something unexpected. She said the music reminded her of her grandmother's house in Mexico, where there had always been something beautiful playing on an old radio. Carmen explained that she'd been so busy working and raising her kids that she'd forgotten how much peace music could bring. She asked Lisa if she knew any Mexican classical pieces, and Lisa was surprised to discover she actually did. Even more shocking was the transformation in Tyler, the teenager who usually sat in the back booth with headphones on, completely absorbed in his phone. Lisa had assumed he'd hate classical music and probably wouldn't even notice it. But during her third day of playing, she noticed Tyler had removed his headphones and was actually listening. When she took her break, Tyler nervously approached her. His hands were shaking slightly as he explained that he'd been having panic attacks lately, especially at school. The classical music somehow made his mind feel calmer than anything else he'd tried. He asked if she could teach him the names of the pieces she played so he could find them online to listen to when he felt anxious. Lisa was amazed to learn that Tyler actually knew quite a bit about music. He played guitar and had been teaching himself music theory through YouTube videos. He'd never heard classical music performed live before, and it was opening up a whole new world for him. They started having conversations about different composers and musical styles that revealed Tyler to be much more thoughtful and intelligent than his typical teenage behavior suggested. The biggest surprise came from the group of truck drivers who regularly stopped at Murphy's for late-night coffee and meals. Lisa had pictured them as rough, uninterested in anything artistic. But when she started playing during evening shifts, their reactions amazed her. Big Eddie, a man who looked like he could wrestle bears for fun, turned out to be incredibly knowledgeable about classical music. He'd grown up in a family where his mother played piano, and he could identify composers and specific pieces with impressive accuracy. When Lisa played a batch piece one evening, Eddie actually requested a specific movement from a different batch composition that he remembered from his childhood. Another driver, an older man named Joe, revealed that he'd wanted to learn violin as a kid, but his family couldn't afford lessons. He'd spent years listening to classical radio stations while driving cross-country routes, developing a deep appreciation for orchestral music. Joe started timing his stops to coincide with Lisa's playing sessions, and would sit quietly at the counter with his coffee, completely absorbed in the music. What moved Lisa most was seeing how the music brought out hidden depths in people she'd served for years without really knowing them. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who came in every Wednesday for tea and soup, mentioned that Lisa's playing reminded her of concerts she'd attended with her late husband 50 years ago. She'd stop by on days when Lisa wasn't scheduled just to ask when the violin music would return. Even the kitchen staff started paying attention. Maria, the cook who had worked at Murphy's for over a decade, began timing her breaks to coincide with Lisa's performances. She told Lisa that the music made the stressful rush of preparing orders feel less overwhelming. The dishwasher, a quiet young man who rarely spoke to anyone, started humming classical melodies while he worked. Lisa began to understand that she'd been making assumptions based on appearances and circumstances rather than seeing people as whole human beings with complex inner lives. Just because someone worked a blue-collar job or didn't have a college education didn't mean they couldn't appreciate beauty or have sophisticated emotional responses to art. The music was creating connections between people who had been strangers despite seeing each other regularly. Frank started conversations with other customers about pieces Lisa had played. Carmen and Tyler discovered they both loved the same gentle melody and began sitting at adjacent tables during the music sessions. The truck drivers started recommending classical pieces to each other and sharing memories triggered by specific compositions. Robert noticed the change in atmosphere immediately. The diner felt warmer and more welcoming than it had in years. Customers were staying longer, ordering more food, and some were even bringing friends to experience the unique combination of comfort food and live classical music. Business was actually improving, which was something Robert hadn't expected when he'd agreed to let Lisa try her experiment. But the most important change was in Lisa herself. Playing music regularly was bringing back her confidence and reminding her why she'd fallen in love with the violin in the first place. She started practicing at home again, working on pieces specifically requested by customers. Her technique was improving, and she found herself excited about music in a way she hadn't felt since college. More than that, she was discovering that making music for people who genuinely needed and appreciated it felt more meaningful than any concert hall performance ever could. These weren't people who came to be impressed or to show off their cultural sophistication. They were ordinary people finding moments of beauty and peace in their everyday lives. And Lisa was the one providing that gift. Each day brought new surprises as customers revealed unexpected connections to classical music or shared how the violin performances were affecting their lives. Lisa realized she'd stumbled onto something much bigger than just solving the problem of a broken jukebox. She was creating a space where people could experience art in a natural, unpretentious way, and the results were transforming everyone involved, including herself. As the weeks passed, Lisa noticed that her violin sessions were becoming more than just background music. People were staying longer, arriving earlier, and most surprisingly, they were starting to open up about deeply personal things. The music seemed to create a safe space where customers felt comfortable sharing parts of their lives they'd never talked about before. It started with Frank, the quiet construction worker who had been coming to Murphy's for over 5 years. Lisa had always seen him as a man of few words, someone who kept to himself and didn't seem interested in conversation. But after her third week of playing, Frank lingered after finishing his usual coffee and pie. He seemed to be wrestling with something, glancing at Lisa's violin case several times before finally speaking up. His voice was softer than usual when he told her that her music brought back memories he'd tried to forget. Frank explained that his wife of 32 years had passed away 2 years ago from cancer. She'd been a piano player, not professionally, but she'd filled their home with music every single day. Sunday mornings had been special because she'd play while he made breakfast, and they'd dance slowly in the kitchen while the eggs were cooking. Frank's eyes filled with tears as he described how silent his house had become after she died. He'd put a sheet over her piano because hearing it reminded him too much of what he'd lost. But Lisa's violin playing was different somehow. It brought back the good memories without the overwhelming sadness. For the first time in 2 years, he was remembering the joy his wife's music had brought rather than just the pain of losing her. Lisa felt honored that Frank had shared something so personal with her. She asked if there were any specific pieces his wife used to play, and Frank mentioned a few old hymns and classical pieces he remembered. The next day, Lisa surprised him by playing one of those hymns during her session. Frank sat quietly through the entire piece, and when she finished, he simply nodded his thanks with tears streaming down his face. Carmen's story emerged more gradually. The single mother had been coming to the diner for over a year, but Lisa had never known much about her beyond the fact that she worked incredibly hard to support her 3 children. During one particularly beautiful piece about love and loss, Carmen stayed long after she'd finished eating, just listening with her eyes closed. When Lisa took her break, Carmen shared that she'd once dreamed of being a music teacher. She'd been studying music education in college when she got pregnant with her first child at 19. The father disappeared, and Carmen had to drop out of school to work and support her baby. 2 more children followed with a man who eventually left her as well, and her dreams of teaching music seemed impossibly far away. Carmen explained that she used to sing lullabies to her children when they were babies, but as life got harder and more stressful, she'd stopped making music entirely. She was so exhausted from working 2 jobs that she'd forgotten how much peace music could bring. Hearing Lisa play reminded her of the person she used to be, someone who believed in beauty and possibility. Lisa learned that Carmen still hummed while she worked at the factory, and her coworkers had noticed that she seemed happier during the weeks when she'd been coming to hear the violin music. Carmen asked if Lisa might teach her children some simple songs. She wanted to bring music back into their home, even if she couldn't pursue her own musical education anymore. Tyler's story was perhaps the most surprising. The teenager who'd seemed so absorbed in his phone and headphones was actually dealing with severe anxiety that had started affecting his schoolwork and relationships. His parents had tried therapy and medication, but nothing seemed to help with the racing thoughts and panic attacks that had begun dominating his life. Tyler explained that classical music was the only thing that consistently calmed his mind. He discovered this by accident when a teacher played some Bach during a particularly stressful exam. The complex patterns and mathematical structure of classical compositions somehow organized his chaotic thoughts in a way nothing else could manage. He'd been too embarrassed to tell his parents about this discovery because he thought they'd find it weird that a 17-year-old found peace in centuries-old music. But Lisa's performances gave him a regular dose of the calm he desperately needed. Tyler had started researching the pieces she played and learning about different composers and musical periods. Most touching of all, Tyler revealed that he'd been thinking about learning violin himself. He'd been afraid to ask his parents for lessons because money was tight and he didn't want to seem ungrateful after they'd already spent so much on his anxiety treatment. But watching Lisa play made it seem possible that he could create his own moments of peace rather than just waiting for someone else to provide them. Big Eddie's story came out during a late evening shift when the diner was nearly empty. The intimidating truck driver, who looked like he could handle any trouble, turned out to be one of the gentlest souls Lisa had ever met. He told her about growing up in a house where his mother played piano every evening after dinner. Music had been the thread that held his family together during difficult times. Eddie's mother had insisted that all her children learn to appreciate classical music, even though they didn't have money for private lessons. She'd save up to take them to free concerts at the local college, and she'd explain what made each piece special. Eddie credited those experiences with teaching him that beauty exists everywhere. Even in the toughest circumstances, he'd carried that love of music with him through 20 years of truck driving, listening to classical radio stations during long hauls across the country. But he'd never told his fellow drivers about this interest because he was afraid they'd think it was strange. Hearing Lisa play in such a casual, accepting environment made him feel like he could finally be open about something that had brought enjoy his entire life. The most unexpected revelation came from Robert himself. The diner owner had been watching the changes in his customers and employees, and one evening he pulled Lisa aside to share his own connection to her music. Robert revealed that he'd been a music major in college over 30 years ago, studying classical guitar before life. Circumstances forced him to take over his family's struggling restaurant business. He'd put away his guitar when he inherited Murphy's Diner and never looked back, convincing himself that music was a luxury he couldn't afford. But hearing Lisa play had awakened something in him that he'd thought was completely dead. Robert admitted that he'd been going home and practicing guitar again for the first time in decades. Inspired by the joy he saw music bringing to his customers, each personal story revealed how much people had been carrying inside them, waiting for the right moment or safe space to share their deepest connections to beauty and meaning. Lisa realized that her violin wasn't just providing entertainment or background noise. It was creating a bridge between people's everyday struggles and their deepest dreams, reminding them of who they used to be or who they still hope to become. The transformation of Murphy's Diner happened so gradually that at first, Lisa didn't notice just how dramatically things were changing. It started with small things that seemed unimportant on their own, but when put together, they painted a picture of something remarkable happening. The first sign was the way people started timing their visits. Carmen began adjusting her lunch break to match Lisa's violin sessions, even when it meant eating later than usual. Tyler would show up on days when he didn't even need food, ordering just a soda so he could sit and listen. Frank started coming in twice a week instead of once, always making sure to arrive before the music began. But it wasn't just the regular customers who were changing their routines. Lisa noticed new faces appearing during her violin sessions, people who had clearly heard about the music from friends or coworkers. A woman in a business suit started showing up every Thursday, explaining that her colleague had told her about the amazing violin player at Murphy's. An elderly man began driving 20 minutes from across town because his neighbor had raved about the peaceful atmosphere. The lunch rush, which had always been hectic and stressful, started feeling different. Instead of people hurrying through their meals and rushing back to work, customers began lingering. The violin music created a calm atmosphere that seemed to slow everything down in the best possible way. People ate more slowly, had longer conversations, and genuinely seemed to enjoy their time at the diner rather than just treating it as a quick pit stop. Robert noticed the change in his sales figures first. People were ordering dessert more often, something that rarely happened during busy lunch periods. They were buying extra coffee, staying for second cups instead of grabbing their food and leaving. The average ticket price per customer had increased by almost 30%, not because Robert had raised prices, but because people were simply enjoying themselves enough to order more. Even more surprising was the type of customers the diner was attracting. A group of lawyers from the downtown office building started having their weekly lunch meetings at Murphy's, explaining that the classical music helped them think more clearly than the noisy sports bar they used to frequent. A book club began, meeting there on Sunday afternoons, with the members saying that Lisa's violin playing created the perfect backdrop for their literary discussions. The most unexpected new customers were the families with young children. Parents discovered that their usually restless kids became calm and well-behaved during the violin sessions. One mother told Robert that her 3-year-old son, who normally couldn't sit still for 5 minutes, would listen to Lisa's music with complete focus for the entire performance. Families started planning their weekend meals around the violin schedule. Dr. Williams, a pediatrician from the medical center nearby, became a regular after hearing about the calming effect the music had on children. She told Lisa that she'd been recommending classical music to parents of anxious children for years, but seeing it work in person at Murphy's Diner was remarkable. She started bringing colleagues from the hospital, and soon several medical professionals were using their lunch breaks to decompress with Lisa's violin music. The diner's atmosphere was changing in ways that went beyond just the music itself. Conversations became more thoughtful and meaningful. Strangers started talking to each other about the pieces Lisa played, creating connections that wouldn't have happened otherwise. The usual tension and rush of a busy restaurant were replaced by something that felt almost like a community gathering place. Local business owners began to take notice. The bookstore owner across the street mentioned to Robert that she'd seen more foot traffic in the area during Lisa's performance times. The flower shop next door started staying open later because customers would browse after their meals at Murphy's. The entire block seemed to benefit from the peaceful energy the diner was creating. Social media played a role in spreading the word, though in an organic way that surprised everyone. Customers started posting photos of their meals with captions about the beautiful violin music, not as advertisements but as genuine expressions of how the experience had touched them. A food blogger wrote a review that focused more on the atmosphere and music than the actual food, calling Murphy's an unexpected oasis of culture and calm. The most significant change was in the staff themselves. Maria, the cook, told Robert that work felt less stressful when Lisa was playing. The kitchen crew started moving more smoothly, working together like musicians in their own right. Even during the busiest lunch rushes, there was a sense of harmony that hadn't existed before. Amy, the other waitress who worked different shifts than Lisa, asked Robert if she could learn to play an instrument too. She'd never been musical before, but seeing how much joy Lisa brought to customers made her want to contribute something similar. Robert surprised everyone by saying he'd help pay for guitar lessons if Amy was serious about learning. The local newspaper got wind of the story when a reporter happened to stop by for lunch during one of Lisa's performances. The article that followed wasn't just about a waitress who played violin, but about how art could transform ordinary spaces and bring communities together. The reporter described Murphy's as proof that culture doesn't have to be confined to concert halls and museums. The piece attracted attention from neighboring towns, and Murphy's started getting visitors from places they'd never drawn customers from before. People would drive 30 or 40 minutes just to experience the unique combination of comfort food and live classical music. Robert had to hire additional staff to handle the increased business, but the most meaningful transformation was in the sense of belonging that developed among the regular customers. People who had been strangers despite eating at the same restaurant for years began to know each other's names and stories. Frank started saving a seat for Tyler during afternoon sessions. Carmen and Mrs. Patterson discovered they both loved the same gentle melodies and began sitting together. The truck drivers formed their own classical music appreciation group. Sharing recommendations and memories, Lisa watched all of this unfold with amazement and growing confidence. She'd started this journey just trying to fill an uncomfortable silence, but somehow she'd created something much more important. Murphy's Diner had become a place where people felt safe to be vulnerable, where strangers became friends, and where the universal language of music broke down barriers that normally kept people isolated. The violin case that had sat unused in her car for months had become the tool that transformed not just her own life, but an entire community's daily experience. What had begun as a simple solution to a broken jukebox had evolved into something that none of them could have imagined. When Lisa first nervously asked Robert if she could play background music for the customers, the phone call that changed everything came on a Wednesday morning in November. Lisa was setting up her violin before the lunch rush when Robert approached her with an expression she'd never seen before. He looked excited, nervous, and slightly overwhelmed all at once. A reporter from the city newspaper wanted to do a feature story about Murphy's Diner and the violin music that was drawing people from all over the region. Lisa's first reaction was panic. She'd never been interviewed by anyone, let alone a professional journalist. What if she said something stupid? What if the attention ruined the special atmosphere they'd created? But Robert was practically bouncing with excitement. The newspaper had called him after receiving dozens of letters and emails from readers who had visited the diner, specifically because of word-of-mouth recommendations about the music. The reporter, a woman named Janet who covered human interest stories, arrived during Lisa's afternoon session. Instead of interrupting the music, she quietly took a seat and observed. Lisa could see her taking notes, but more importantly, she could see Janet's genuine emotional response to the music and the atmosphere in the diner. What impressed Janet most wasn't just Lisa's playing, though she noted the exceptional quality of the performance. It was the way customers reacted to the music and to each other. She watched Frank wipe away tears during a particularly moving piece. She saw Tyler's shoulders relax as the classical melodies calmed his anxiety. She observed strangers striking up conversations about the music, sharing memories and emotions they might never have expressed otherwise. The interview itself felt more like a conversation with a friend than a formal news story. Janet asked about Lisa's background, but she was more interested in the transformation that had occurred at Murphy's Diner. She wanted to understand how classical music had broken down social barriers and created genuine connections between people. From completely different walks of life, Lisa found herself opening up about her struggles after music school, the years of feeling like her education had been wasted, and the accidental discovery that her true calling might be bringing music to people in unexpected places. Janet listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions about the difference between performing in concert halls versus playing for people who desperately needed beauty in their everyday lives. The article appeared on the front page of the Sunday edition 2 weeks later. The headline read, "The Violin Waitress: How Classical Music Transformed a Small-Town Diner." But the story was about much more than Lisa's personal journey. Janet had captured the essence of what made Murphy's Diner special, the way art could create community, heal emotional wounds, and remind people of their shared humanity. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By Monday morning, the diner was packed with people who had read the article and wanted to experience the music for themselves. Cars with license plates from neighboring states filled the parking lot. Robert had to put up a sign limiting groups to 1-hour stays during peak times just to accommodate everyone who wanted to visit. Local television stations picked up the story, sending camera crews to film Lisa's performances and interview the regular customers who had become part of the Murphy's Diner family. Frank, who had never spoken to a reporter in his life, found himself on the evening news explaining how violin music had helped him process his grief and remember his late wife with joy instead of only sadness. The attention brought opportunities that Lisa had never imagined possible. The Regional Symphony Orchestra called to invite her to audition for their upcoming season. A recording company expressed interest in creating an album of acoustic performances recorded at Murphy's Diner, a music therapy program at the nearby university. Reached out about collaborating on research into the healing effects of classical music in non-traditional settings. Most surprisingly, other restaurants and businesses began contacting Lisa about bringing live classical music to their establishments. Coffee shops wanted her to play during morning hours. Bookstores asked about evening performances. Even a retirement home inquired about regular visits to play for their residents who could no longer travel to concert halls. The flood of opportunities felt both exciting and terrifying. After years of struggling to find any musical work, Lisa suddenly had more offers than she could possibly accept. She could finally leave waitressing behind and make a living doing what she loved. The student loans that had haunted her for years could finally be paid off. She could rent a better apartment, maybe even buy a car that didn't break down every few months. But the most meaningful recognition came from her regular customers at Murphy's. They organized a surprise celebration one Thursday afternoon, bringing homemade cakes and handwritten cards expressing what her music had meant to them. Tyler presented her with a notebook where he'd written down all the pieces she'd played and what each one had made him feel. Carmen brought her 3 children to meet Lisa and hear her play for the first time. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who came for tea every Wednesday, gave Lisa a photograph from 1952 showing herself and her late husband at a classical concert. She explained that Lisa's music had brought back 50 years of beautiful memories she thought she'd lost forever. Frank, in his gruff but sincere way, told Lisa that she'd given him back his wife's gift of music without the overwhelming sadness he'd felt before. The celebration made Lisa realize something important about the choice she was facing. Yes, she could take one of the prestigious opportunities and return to the traditional classical music world she'd originally trained for. She could perform in concert halls for audiences who understood music theory and could appreciate technical perfection. But would those audiences need her music the way Frank needed it? Would symphony concertgoers find the same healing that Tyler discovered in her performances? Would recording albums reach people like Carmen, who had forgotten their own musical dreams until Lisa reminded them that beauty could exist anywhere? The newspaper article had brought Lisa recognition and opened doors she'd thought were permanently closed. Recording companies and symphony orchestras represented the success she'd once dreamed of achieving. But success looked different now than it had when she was a struggling music student drowning in debt and rejection letters. Robert watched Lisa grapple with her decision and offered his own perspective. He reminded her that Murphy's Diner had become something special largely because of her music, but also because of the community that had formed around it. The regular customers weren't just coming for entertainment. They were coming for connection, healing, and hope. The recognition felt wonderful after years of feeling invisible and unappreciated. Seeing her story in the newspaper, watching television, interviews with her customers, and receiving offers from prestigious musical organizations validated everything she'd worked for in music school. But it also forced her to confront a fundamental question. What did she really want her music to accomplish in the world? As phone calls and emails poured in with increasingly impressive offers, Lisa realized she had a choice that would define not just her career, but her entire understanding of what it meant to be a musician. The broken jukebox that had started this journey seemed like a lifetime ago, but the decision she made now would determine whether her accidental discovery at Murphy's Diner would become the foundation for something even more meaningful. The decision that would change everything came to Lisa during a quiet moment on a snowy December evening. She was playing a gentle piece for the small group of customers who had braved the weather to come to Murphy's Diner. As she looked around the room, she saw Frank sitting alone at his usual table, but instead of the sadness that used to cloud his face, he was smiling peacefully. Tyler was in his corner booth, no longer anxious but genuinely relaxed for maybe the first time since she'd known him. Carmen had brought her youngest daughter, who was listening with the pure wonder that only children possess. The scene crystallized something Lisa had been struggling to understand for weeks. The offers from symphony orchestras and recording companies represented everything she'd once thought she wanted: financial security, professional recognition, the chance to perform in prestigious venues for sophisticated audiences. These opportunities could finally validate all those years of study and practice that had seemed wasted when she was just serving coffee and clearing tables. But as she played that evening, watching how her music touched the lives of people who had become like family to her, Lisa realized that success meant something completely different than what she'd been taught in music school. The traditional path offered prestige and money, but this unexpected journey had given her something more valuable: the knowledge that her music could heal, connect, and transform ordinary moments into something beautiful. The next morning, Lisa called the symphony orchestra and politely declined their audition offer. The conversation was difficult because the opportunity was genuinely prestigious, and the conductor seemed baffled by her decision. How could she turn down a chance to play with professional musicians in a world-class venue? Lisa tried to explain that she'd found her true calling in bringing classical music to people who wouldn't normally have access to it. But she could hear the confusion in his voice. The recording company was equally surprised when she turned down their contract. They'd envisioned an album called Music from Murphy's Diner that would capitalize on her viral story. The marketing potential was enormous, they explained. But Lisa realized that commercializing what had happened at the diner would change its essential nature. The magic wasn't in the performance itself, but in the relationships and community that had grown around the music. Instead of pursuing traditional success, Lisa began developing an idea that had been growing in her mind for weeks. What if she could recreate what had happened at Murphy's Diner in other unexpected places? What if classical music could transform other communities the way it had transformed theirs? She started by reaching out to the music therapy program at the university that had contacted her, Dr. Martinez, the program director, was fascinated by Lisa's experiences and eager to collaborate on research. Together, they designed a pilot program to bring live classical music to places where people needed hope and healing: homeless shelters, community centers in low-income neighborhoods, senior living facilities, and even hospitals. The first location Lisa chose was a community center in a rough part of town, a place where teenagers went after school because they had nowhere else to go. The staff was skeptical when Lisa showed up with her violin case, wondering how classical music would connect with kids who were dealing with poverty, family problems, and violence in their neighborhoods. Lisa started playing the same way she had at Murphy's Diner, quietly and without fanfare. At first, the teenagers ignored her completely, continuing their conversations and games. But gradually, just as it had happened with Tyler, some of them began to listen. A girl named Rosa, who'd been kicked out of 3 schools for fighting, sat down near Lisa during her second visit and listened to an entire piece without moving. The breakthrough came when Lisa started asking the teenagers what emotions they wanted to express through music. She discovered that many of them were dealing with feelings they didn't have words for: grief over lost friends, anger about unfair circumstances, hope for better futures. Lisa began choosing pieces that matched these emotions, and slowly, the young people started opening up about their lives and dreams. Within a month, the community center had a waiting list of teenagers who wanted to be there during Lisa's visits. Some started asking about learning instruments themselves. The center's director told Lisa that the atmosphere had changed completely on the days she came to play. There were fewer fights, more conversations, and a sense of possibility that hadn't existed before. Encouraged by this success, Lisa expanded her program to a nursing home where many residents rarely had visitors. She found that older people often had deep connections to classical music from their youth, and her performances awakened memories they'd thought were lost forever. One elderly man who hadn't spoken in months began humming along to pieces his mother had played for him 80 years earlier. Robert watched Lisa's new venture with mixed emotions. He was proud of what she was accomplishing, but he was also worried about losing the special atmosphere that had made Murphy's Diner famous. Lisa assured him that the diner would always be her home base, the place where she discovered her true calling. She arranged her schedule so she could still play there 3 times a week, maintaining the community that had become so important to all of them. The local newspaper followed Lisa's expanding work, documenting how her Music for Everyone program was bringing classical music to communities that had never experienced it before. The articles attracted attention from foundations and donors who were interested in supporting innovative approaches to community building and healing through the arts. Within 6 months, Lisa had received grants that allowed her to hire other classically trained musicians who were struggling to find meaningful work. The program grew to include a pianist who played at a women's shelter, a cellist who performed at a children's hospital, and a flutist who brought music to elementary schools in underserved neighborhoods. Each musician discovered what Lisa had learned at Murphy's Diner, that bringing art to people who needed it most was more fulfilling than performing for audiences who took culture for granted. They were creating access to beauty in places where beauty was scarce, and the impact was measurable in changed lives and stronger communities. Lisa's story had come full circle, but in a way she never could have imagined when she first nervously asked Robert if she could play her violin to fill the silence left by a broken jukebox. She'd started as a struggling waitress who felt like her expensive education was worthless. Now, she was the director of a nonprofit organization that was changing how people thought about classical music and its role in society. The program continued to grow, attracting musicians from around the country who wanted to be part of something meaningful rather than just commercially successful. Lisa traveled to conferences and workshops, sharing her story and inspiring others to find creative ways to bring art into unexpected spaces. But every few days, she still returned to Murphy's Diner, where it all began. She'd play her violin for Frank, Tyler, Carmen, and the others who had become her chosen family. The broken jukebox had long since been repaired, but it stayed silent during Lisa's performances. The music that filled Murphy's diner now came from something much more powerful than any machine. It came from the human heart. Reaching out to other hearts, creating connections that would last a lifetime, Lisa had learned that sometimes the most important journeys begin with the smallest steps, and that success isn't always found where you expect to look for it. Her music had found its true purpose not in grand concert halls, but in the quiet moments when strangers became friends, and ordinary places became sanctuaries of hope.